According to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Asia-Pacific region is the most disaster-prone region in the world. Australia has a long history with heat waves, bushfires, drought, flood and tropical cyclones. And as we're going from La Nina to El Nino, meaning potentially a repeat of the 2019-2020 bushfires, what do we do? In this episode, we're talking about emergency preparedness.
My name is Michelle Villeneuve. I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney and also the deputy director at our Centre for Disability Research and Policy. CDRP is actually an impact centre at the University of Sydney. And at the Impact Centre, we really pride ourselves on doing work that makes a difference in policy and in practice. In the work that I do, it is specifically focused on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, and that's really been the focus of my work for the past decade, especially here in Australia, but also overseas.
Every year, about September, we see a rollout of advertisements that say something like, on the first weekend of September, start clearing out your gutters. Or if you live in an area that is on high alert, you do what my family does, and in addition to clearing out the gutters and sweeping the dry leaves, we pack the car as soon as the bushfire threat becomes uncomfortably close, and we drive around with our photographs and belongings, because you just don't know if you're going to come back to a house at all. But what about for people with disabilities? It's not as simple as getting in your car and driving away as fast as possible. What if you're someone with a disability living in a rural community, where the closest shops are a couple of hours away? Michelle talks about how her life work started and explains how a good emergency preparedness plan starts with you.
There's a few avenues inroads, I suppose, that I've had into this discipline. It's actually an emerging discipline area, which is quite exciting to see. The idea of and the practice of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction is new, and it's an emerging area. But how did I get to that? There's a few avenues. The one thing that I tell people about myself when I'm working with people in the community is to say that I came across this idea, or the importance, or recognized, I suppose, the importance of inclusion, partly because I come from an allied health background and I've always worked in communities with people. And in my early days of practice, I was working with children and families. And at the time, I think I thought I had this really strong idea of what inclusion was all about. But it was not until I became the foster parent of a child with a disability that I truly felt what inclusion, or rather exclusion, is about. And I think that was one of the things that has clearly strengthened my resolve to focus my career on meaningful inclusion outcomes for people with disability. But it's not the only thing. So early in my career, working as an occupational therapist, when the war in Bosnia was on, I had the opportunity to be invited to work on recovery in the context of the war in Bosnia. And I think those experiences were hugely formative in shaping my understanding of what is community all about, what are local assets all about, especially when they've been destroyed as a result of war. And what is resilience really on a very human level in making do every day. So again, that was a massive growth opportunity for me. I learned quite a lot from the people that I was working alongside about rebuilding services and supports in the community and at the community level. But I suppose the other thing is that I've always worked in community and with community. So disability inclusive disaster risk reduction and these things kind of converge together into this real focus that we have on inclusive disaster risk reduction.
So when you were a foster mum to the child with a disability, you mentioned you observed the exclusions. What were the exclusions?
There was a pivotal moment, actually. So prior to this little guy coming into our lives, my daughter and I had always gone to library program on Saturday morning. It was the thing that we did. So when Finn came into our lives, of course, we tottered off to library program now with 2 kids in tow. It was in those moments of sitting on the steps and being involved in the librarians reading stories participating in role play, that all the little kids' hands shoot up to participate. And in that moment, I had Finn. I was holding his balance to sit on the stair. The stair was actually the perfect height for his hip and his knee angles. I could get some really good stability and weight bearing and kind of have him sitting there alongside all of the other kids. And of course, when he went to put up his hand, he lost his balance a little bit, and he couldn't speak verbally. So he wasn't able to share what he wanted to participate in. And it was in those moments where the exclusion, this passive form of exclusion, overlooking Finn's little hand up, overlooking his great desire to participate, I think that was what really hit me. But also it was all those subtle experiences. Suddenly, I used to be involved in all kinds of conversations with other parents before, during, and after that story time. But when you have a child with a complex disability sitting right next to you, suddenly people were less inclined to reach out and have those conversations and those anecdotal experiences. Yeah.
Interesting. And how did that make you feel, like, as a foster parent?
Yeah, well, as any parent, I think back to my days of working as a therapist, and when parents were talking about their goals for kids, they weren't talking about handwriting and gross motor skill development. They were talking about being invited to birthday parties. And they were talking about those as their key goals. And I think it really hit home in those moments that what real inclusion is actually about feeling like you belong in that space. And feeling like you belong doesn't mean that everyone is going to know. The librarian isn't going to know how to involve or help Finn to participate. But to be reached out as the parent, how can I help? How can I get him involved? Can you come and assist? Those are the sorts of gestures. So I don't think it's anyone's fault that it happens, but you can see it's just subtle acts of omission. And so I know, working in this field for many decades now, I know that that's what it's like for my friends and colleagues and people with disability that I work alongside. They experience this on a routine basis. So I've had some glimpses over a few years, a period of time, of what that's really like.
So how did you go from foster mother to then going to the war in Bosnia and then working there? Like, how did you even get there?
Actually, the war in Bosnia was long before I had any children, and probably only possible because of that. I'd been working in the community, and because I'd been working solely in the community, out of my car in remote areas this is in Canada and in Ontario. So my experience comes from working in regional areas of Ontario, in some French first-speaking communities where language is a barrier to communicate, and also in metropolitan Toronto, where there's new immigrants and, big, busy, bustling city. But it's always been in the community, using local resources and local assets. When the war was on in Bosnia, the Canadian government had a partnership with Queen's University. And Queen's University had a partnership with the organization that I was working for. So they were looking for an occupational therapist who would be willing to go to Bosnia immediately following the war and to support with some of the post-war reconstruction, so they were calling it at the time. But they were intentionally looking for someone who had never worked in an institution, in a hospital, in a therapy clinic. And they were strategic about that because they didn't want that baggage of needing all the bells and the whistles of a clinic. They wanted someone who could really work with what was on hand.
Okay. And so what do you think were your key learnings as an occupational therapist? Because it didn't even occur to me that they would be like, we need an occupational therapist in Bosnia right now to deal with the aftermath of a war. Like, that wouldn't have been anything that I would have thought about.
That is really a good point. And maybe I make that assumption about what post-war or post-disaster reconstruction looks like. But if you think about any sort of disaster, and in this case, human conflict, our institutions and our practices and our services are what get destroyed. So in that case, hospitals were destroyed, clinics were destroyed. But for 4 years of war, all of the therapy services and the people who benefit from those services were left without education and professional development and opportunities to access those services. So the real focus of that project was on community-based rehabilitation and a lot of those principles about community development that underlie that being brought back into community, starting with where people were at and developing or redeveloping services and supports. I had the wonderful opportunity of at that time working with a very small but very willing group of physiotherapists who were willing to become Bosnia's first occupational therapists, and we had the pleasure of.
That's so unreal. Go on.
Yeah, we had. We did 2 generations, and I made all the mistakes with the first generation of OTs, and then I improved them with the second. The first generation of OTs, we had 6 students, and everything was done via translation. So I was speaking in English, everything was interpreted in Bosnian. I would hear it in Bosnian, so I would get this enriched education, hearing what I just said in Bosnian. And then the answers would come from the students, and then they would be interpreted back in English to me, and I would be writing in Bosnian on the board. And so I had this lovely opportunity of working with these 6 wonderful therapists we intentionally picked them from different regions of Bosnia so that we could actually develop a bit of a train-the-trainer approach. They would go back to where they were living, working, and playing, and bring some of these principles around occupational therapy and community-based approaches back into the community. But when I say I made some mistakes, the biggest mistake I made in the design of that program was I brought them all to Canada for their fieldwork placement. And that was the wrong thing to do because, well, it was great and it was a wonderful learning opportunity. When you bring people from a post-war context into a resource-rich environment, it's really easy to get distracted by the shiny things and the resources and the sort of the plethora of available stuff at your hand. So I think that was actually a detriment to their learning. And we had to kind of unlearn those things when we went back to Bosnia together and did the final bits of their placement in Bosnia without the gift of and the presence of all of those resources, and had to just, unlearn and rethink about doing things in a simpler way.
That's so interesting. It's really interesting that first world opportunities are at a detriment to somebody who, to a situation that firstly I didn't even think about, like why are physiotherapists out there? I'm like, oh, of course they would be out there. And then why would you need an occupational therapist? Of course you'd need an occupational therapist. And then to say your first world resources are actually at a detriment to you as a developing country is super weird to say out loud.
Yeah, I think in that context of people being education rich and culture rich country, and then of course having to go through 4 years of war. These were people who were hungry for knowledge and hungry for information and hungry for the newest technologies and the best way of doing things. But of course, working with people in communities and working on inclusion and starting with where they're at doesn't actually require a lot of bells and whistles and technology to do that really effectively.
Hence why they didn't want somebody from an institution going to Bosnia. Okay, I get it now. I'm putting all the connections together. So then how do you go from that to being a foster mother to then basically arriving to Australia to now be doing emergency preparedness of people with disabilities in Australia?
Yeah, we have to touch on the Australian thing, don't we? Because how did that come about? And Australia being one of those highly disaster-prone countries in the world. And well, I guess there is a little interim step in there in about 2007 to 9. So after the tsunami that hit Asia, if you recall, a lot of countries were hit by that tsunami, and one of them was Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka at the time was also undergoing civil war. So civil war and the tsunami hit. And so our team at Queen's University, again, was doing some work there. In that case, it was about rethinking social work services, rethinking the delivery of social services. And again, some of the same principles, right? So instead of having people in bureaucratic government offices getting their individualized needs met by specific bureaucrats within government, it was really about placing social workers at the local level of community and thinking of people's and their needs holistically. So a mother who has a child with a disability who's experiencing domestic violence, instead of going to 3 different departments, would receive social work services in a more holistic way at the local community level. So we were doing that type of work. And, you know, that's kind of the thing sometimes about war and about disasters. They provide opportunities to rebuild and rethink in new ways. And I think that was the interesting thing about that project in Sri Lanka. It was an opportunity for the social work faculty there, for the social work services in the sector and government to rethink how they deliver services and what could be a new way for us to achieve that. And so, yeah, so that's what happened in that context. So it was a little bit after that, that I finished my PhD, and I had this, this wonderful email that came that said, oh, they're looking for faculty at the University of Sydney, and those faculty need to have expertise in community development and, you know, working in novel and unique contexts or non-traditional roles, as they would call it in the occupational therapy profession. And we're situated here at the time it was the Faculty of Health Sciences. And I thought, this is a hard to ignore advertisement because it seemed to speak to every aspect of my role. But alas, I did ignore it for a little while, and it just kept coming back to me. So eventually. You're like,
Michelle, are you not reading our emails?
You're not reading the tea leaves or whatever it is. But, you know, it is one of those things. It's a big move to move across the world with a then 13-year-old daughter by the time we actually made the move. And so to move across the world with a 13-year-old daughter is a big move. So maybe that's why I pushed it back a little bit here and there. But nonetheless, Australia called and en route we were. But one of the exciting things that was happening at the same time was my good colleague and mentor, Professor Gwyneth Llewellyn, had been just initiating a project in Indonesia. And she was working with a German international NGO. And they contacted us to say, we're really good at disaster risk reduction. You guys are really good at disability inclusion. Can we partner on this DFAT, or Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, funded research project? And that was when Gwyneth and myself got to know each other. She knew that I was coming to the faculty and she knew my background. She had these lovely partnerships in Indonesia, and we all started to work together on disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction, but in the Indonesian context. And so that's what began in 2013. And that was sort of the germination, if you will, of what we've been carrying on in Australia since then.
You've worked Indonesia, Sri Lanka, in Bosnia, and now Australia. What are the very stark differences that you have seen when it comes to disability inclusion and emergency and disaster recovery and that sort of thing that different countries have taken on?
It's a good question. I'm not so sure I can answer it in terms of what's different, but maybe what's similar. Yeah, maybe in terms of what's similar. And I think what's really similar is that where I started this conversation, the sense of fighting for the right to belong and fighting for the right to have equal opportunities alongside other people. And I think I've had the pleasure of working alongside pretty passionate people who are also either disabled themselves or advocates for people with disability or allies of some sort working in this cause. So I suppose we're a group unto ourselves with a bit of a passion and a campaigning and an advocacy that comes behind what we do and how we approach things. So I suppose what's similar across all of those contexts is finding those like-minded people and finding that common ground to grow what needs to happen. But I think the other thing is, if you think about the timeline for all of this, this is all happening around just before and immediately after the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. So we have now this international treaty and looks at countries' obligations, nations' obligations under this to support inclusion. I suppose what was exciting for me through that period of time, it was like an enriched learning opportunity to learn alongside policy decision makers, academics, people at the grassroots of community development, disabled people's organizations and advocates and their work. And it was like a living lab for how is this UN convention going to play out in people's lives, and the opportunities for how that would happen.
You mentioned that Australia is one of the most disaster-prone places in the world. It's probably a lot of it is probably fire, but we have seen an uptake in floods, and the way the trajectory of climate change and all of that going forward, it's going to be, I don't know if I'm right or not, but I feel like it's just going to be a pretty rough ride. Do you want to just talk about your website for a little bit and talk about the 4 steps of emergency preparedness?
Yeah, for sure. Creating a person-centered emergency preparedness suite of resources now. It's a philosophy, it's a toolkit, and I think it's sort of got its own advocacy campaign now that's beginning to give it a lot of life in the community. It came about from an early project we were working on in Australia. So if I backtrack for just a second and say we were doing this work in Indonesia, and we were bringing these disabled people's organizations together with disaster risk reduction actors from the government and non-government organizations. And, one of the biggest things that we learned in Indonesia was that people weren't working together because they felt they somehow needed technical knowledge or expertise that each other had. So the disabled people's organizations would say, oh, we can't do disaster risk reduction because we don't have any knowledge of disasters and disaster risk. And at the same time, our disaster risk reduction actors and government stakeholders would say, well, we can't do disability inclusion because we don't have any technical knowledge about people with disability and disability needs. And so that project was really all about bringing people in conversation. And I think that theme of in conversation is really critical to what we've produced since then and the tools that we've been co-designing and rolling out since that time. It was around that time that our colleagues here in Australia were learning, particularly from fire and emergency services, rural fire services in particular, but also fire and emergency and state emergency services here in New South Wales. They were hearing about what we were doing in Indonesia because we were reporting on it and sharing information. And they said, why aren't we doing that here in Australia? We need to be doing that here too. So we brought the same methodology. We started bringing groups together at the local government level, people who don't normally play together. We brought them into rooms together to have these hard, sometimes confronting, difficult conversations where each person has a different type of expertise they bring to the table. And in fact, we can only collaborate or change or work toward inclusive disaster risk reduction if we all bring that knowledge and the piece of the puzzle together. It was during that very first project that we created, we called them Local Emergency Management Guidelines for Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction in New South Wales. It's a bit of a handful, but we had some method in our madness. We wanted to bring the lexicon of DIDRR into Australia. That was the language being used internationally and in the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction organization and so on. So we wanted to make sure we weren't changing the language. So as cumbersome as DIDRR is, we wanted to bring it in. We also wanted to bring in the principles that underlie it, accessibility, participation, non-discrimination, and collaboration. But the thing about those principles is they're a little bit nebulous, like they're a bit fuzzy. How do you put those into action? So the project was about unpacking and making actionable nuggets. And we created these local emergency management guidelines so that emergency managers could take some action locally and feel like they were more confident and able to do something to make their work more inclusive.
When you put all this together, and then you were going to local area managers and emergency services, and you're like, we've got this. How responsive were people?
You know what? I have to say, from the very beginning of this project, let's go back 2015, I would say that project was sort of the germination of what we're doing here in New South Wales. I would say people were overwhelmingly interested. Our government and emergency services knew that disability was in the too hard box, didn't know how to take it out of the too hard box, and were more than willing to learn. So I think that was a really exciting welcome to the project. What was a little trickier was getting disability and community services around the table, not because they weren't interested, but because they've actually, frankly, been as excluded from disaster risk reduction as the people that they support in the community. So it wasn't really clear, why would I come to a conversation about, emergency management and emergency planning? And then the other practicality was that, people living their lives, and especially people who are providing services and support in the community, are busy providing services and support in the community. So finding time to come. So those were some of the early challenges that we were able to overcome. But yeah, those were the things we were thinking about in the early days of the project. We created a problem with that project. So we created these guidelines and we created these 4 actionable nuggets. And these actionable nuggets were meant to bring those DIDR principles to life, ways you could actually do this. But we created a problem because one of those actionable nuggets was people with disability need tools where they can self-assess their level of preparedness, their own capabilities, and their support needs, and make plans that are tailored to those support needs in a disaster risk situation. And the problem with making that recommendation is that those tools did not exist anywhere in the world. So we boldly made the recommendation and said, okay, so if we're going to make this recommendation, then we better start another project to co-design these tools and prepare them. So that's really was the origin story, if you will, of the person-centered emergency preparedness toolkit.
I was just thinking about how in Australia there are television advertisements and radio advertisements. And when you're not watching or listening to any of those podcast advertisements that are at the beginning of the month, make sure that you clean out your gutters. At the beginning of November, make sure that you've cleared the area around your place. There are steps that people anyway have to take on themselves to make sure that their house doesn't burn down, because we all pretty much live in the bush. And so why wouldn't that be translated for people with disabilities to take it on themselves at the beginning of a certain month of the year? Make sure that you have contacted your local fire, something like that.
And isn't it interesting, right? Some of the things that we run up against or that we learn with our colleagues with disability is they don't really actually feel welcomed into those conversations. So those conversations, the information, the materials, are quite often not in accessible formats that everyone can understand and use, or not provided in the places and spaces and ways that people would feel trustworthy and comfortable to access and use that information. So that's one of the barriers for people. But another big barrier for people is that I think what we've done for too long from an emergency and a sort of a readiness campaign perspective is we've kind of said, you have to have a plan. You have to get ready. You have to do this. That is so overwhelming for people who have extra support needs. They need to plan around extra people and things they need to sort of sort and navigate and negotiate their preparedness with, and that they have to communicate and make contingencies around. So for most of us, we don't prepare. For people with disability who have these additional things to prepare, that can be quite overwhelming and quite confronting for people. So a big part of what our research has shown over time is that we're starting in the wrong place when we tell people they need to have a plan. And we're starting in the wrong place when we make it sound like that plan is like a finished thing, a product that you can actually just do. And so the part of the PSEP that we introduced, I suppose, into this conversation was starting proximally to where people are. Let's just self-assess our capabilities and our support needs and how we give and manage support on a routine and daily basis, because that actually needs to be the starting point of our preparedness. And when we start there, we actually begin to uncover what people value, how people do manage all kinds of ways that people with disability are overcoming all kinds of inaccessible environments on a routine basis, all kinds of workarounds and contingencies they put into place on an everyday basis to manage. And that, for people with disability, is an amazing starting point for emergency planning, because suddenly they're in the driver's seat. They actually know how to take charge of the situation. And we put them on a level playing field with the emergency sector, who bring a different kind of knowledge. What's your local disaster risk, and what are the things you should be worried about? And so we've created a situation where the PSEP allows that dialogue and that two-way learning. Rather than do this, make a plan, it's like, oh, what can we do to make our information and materials more accessible to you? What kind of information do you need to support your specific needs in the areas of preparedness? How can we, as a local government and council, think about the fact that you might not have access to transportation and we're telling you, evacuate now? Those are the kinds of things that it helps us to bring to the fore.
100%. And I was also thinking about how PSEP doesn't discriminate from any type of disability, because you know your disability better than anyone else. So who would you want to be given the information to the emergency services and the person who is the person with disability, right?
Yeah. Choice, control, agency. So it's really bringing that person-centered language, which we tend to always associate with what disability services and support and healthcare. We bring that language of person-centered planning and care into the emergency sector, and it changes the whole dynamic. It changes the paradigm for emergency planning.
Yeah, and it kind of reframes self-advocacy in a different light. Right. So the more we're talking right now, the more I'm thinking about when people think about advocacy and self-advocacy, it's mainly, let's be honest, up against a government body that has not really come to the party on certain funding or something or other, where it's like there is something missing that we already have a tangible thing to connect with, whether or not it is literally public transport that isn't accessible, or your funds from the NDIS plan, or something we already have in front of you. Whereas this situation is more about the potential of something happening, maybe.
And we all have to take some level of responsibility in that something potentially happening, the risks that we all face in natural hazard emergencies. And, we saw it obviously also with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think what has been really exciting about saying, it's not just about what emergency services can do to rescue you. It's what can you do to take control of the situation. And I think that has been so powerful with the people that we're working with. I think particularly about some of the folks that we've been working with who have intellectual disabilities. And one of my colleagues who always comes to mind when I think back to our early days of these conversations, and he was working through the PSEP workbook. In fact, he was one of the people who helped co-design that workbook. So as he's working through it, we're learning with him and his colleagues about what needs to go in it and what are the tips and strategies from people with disability to people with disability that should be there. And we were having a debrief one day, and he's very aware that his communication can feel a bit jumbled, is the words he used, and a little bit slower to come across and harder for him to get what's in his head out through his mouth in a really efficient time. He's very aware of that. And so in our debrief, he was explaining in this kind of jumbled way how tricky that is for him, and what worried him the most in making his plan for himself and his daughter, who also has a disability, was the idea that something would happen and he'd need to communicate really efficiently and really effectively to be safe, and particularly for his daughter to be safe. And you could tell in this debrief, as he got more worried, just talking about it and sharing this worry with everyone else around the table, he got more jumbled. And he's like, and see, this is what will happen. This is exactly what will happen. Now, cut to nearly, I think, 2 years later, this same individual is teaching person-centered emergency preparedness to other people and leading workshops with people with and without disability. And he's so confident and so capable and articulate about what needs to happen. And it's just wonderful to see not only what can happen when you put that choice and agency, but you let people, I suppose, wrestle with how they are going to navigate some of these things that they know are actually hard to manage every day, and then confront them and overcome them, So
how did he, to answer the question that he was asking, I don't know what to do, what was the solution for him?
I'm glad you asked, because that was really what happened in this moment. So it was a peer debriefing with a few of us researchers and some participant supporters. It was in an online environment, because this is obviously the early days of COVID, and we were separated by distance. And in this online environment, everyone listened incredibly patiently as he got all of those thoughts out. And after, and this is what I love the most about peer-to-peer support groups, because I got to witness it so beautifully in this moment. The peers started to offer strategies that could be used, but they didn't say, hey, why don't you try this? Use this. You must try this. It was none of that language. The language was, you know what? I've experienced that sometimes too. This is what happens to me in these situations, and here's what I've tried. And then someone else would kind of similarly go, yeah, that reminds me of a time when, and I tried this. And over the course of this discussion, people raised a whole bunch of ideas, like having a little card in his wallet, because he always has his wallet. So putting a card in there, and on the card, it could say some key things. I'm having trouble communicating what I need, but this person can be reached at this number to help me share with you what I'm worried about. So a trusted person that could help navigate that. Another person said you could create a list and have that kind of longer list in your Go kit. And that longer list could have a few reminders of things that would help you with communicating with your daughter or with other people. Things, for example, that you wouldn't want to be left behind if you were evacuating, medications or whatever else it is, CPAP machines and so on. So I thought what was lovely about that experience is it was a beautiful illustration of how peer support works. Peers don't tell other people what to do. They share lived experiences, they share stories, and they offer up from their own lived experiences. And then the peers, and in this case, the gentleman that I'm referring to, could pick and choose from the wealth of examples he'd just learned what was going to work for him. He chose the card for his wallet and thought that was going to be the most practical for him.
That's amazing. I love that story. We have skipped over quite a major part of a world event, which was COVID. And that is also a disaster, like a disaster zone in itself. That's not going to be an isolated incident that will happen once in history ever. What were your takeaways / what did you observe / anything?
Well, it's hard to talk about the height of the COVID pandemic and the work we were doing without talking about the height of Australia being on fire just before that.
I know. Oh my God. And the floods. Holy crap.
And so, as you ask me that question, what do I think? I think of New Year's Eve and the first day of January in 2020. And I think of all the stress I was feeling because I felt like our research team needed more answers faster. Australia had been pretty much on fire in different parts of Australia since the August prior. And then, that New Year's was the culmination, and it was the beach evacuations in Malakuta, and so much was happening across the whole, pretty much the whole country. And it was in that moment where I felt somehow I needed all the answers for everybody, just please 3 months ago. and I'm not there yet. This is research and it's co-design. It's a slow process. This is how we do things. And it was in that moment where my colleagues, all disability advocates, it was like they stepped up and they stepped in and they're like, we've got the advocacy thing under control. You go back and do the research thing. We're on this. And what we saw was People with Disability Australia, Queenslanders with Disability Network, Ideas, Disability Information, and a whole bunch of others network together. You saw them on Facebook, you saw them on Twitter, you saw them accessing things, providing support, getting accommodation for people with disability, accessing people. It was all happening seemingly seamlessly, which is, I think, quite amazing for people. I must say, in that moment, I had incredible, I suppose my first response was incredible relief. Like, I felt this incredible support from a whole group of people who'd been excluded for so long from this whole conversation that we were still trying to bring to the party and bring to the table. And they just jumped in with the advocacy. That was pretty massive, a massive thing. And I think really kick-started way more engagement from our disabled people's organizations in this space. And from Ideas Disability Information, their leadership in being an important information source and communication source to so many people with so many different support needs at that time. So that was the background. So that's what's going on at that time. But, you know, at the beginning of February of that year, 2020, we had planned to bring all our peer leaders from across Queensland together so we could start co-designing this PSEP workbook. It was right at that moment. So we all come together in a hotel room in Brisbane. Queenslanders with Disability Network brought 19 of their peer leaders from the different local government areas across Queensland where they provide peer support. We came together for 2 days and we ran this workshop. We had already designed the PSEP because that was something we'd done on that New South Wales project, but we didn't have the workbook. We didn't have the tools for people with disability to kind of work their way through. We didn't have all that lived experience injected into it. So that's what this workshop was all about. It was really about bringing it to life through their eyes, voice, perspective. And also with this mission, they would then go off and embed it into peer support across Queensland. And then we would study that and we would look at what needs to happen there. So we come together at this workshop, 19 of them at the time, and then a few more that we followed up with online because for accessibility reasons and personal life experiences, they couldn't be in the room with us. So there were 25 in total. And we finished the workshop. I got back on a plane to come back to Sydney, and then Australia shut down. And we had thankfully run this workshop. We had 19 plus the 6 we were working with online, really embracing and really owning emergency preparedness planning and really understanding this capability wheel, which we can talk more about, and understanding a stepwise approach to how this should happen. And then the world shuts down and we go, wait a minute, we were going to develop this workbook for all hazards, but can we just put that aside for a second and get a COVID-19 guide out there? Because people need to, you know, understand their risk. They need to make a plan. They need to be safe and communicate with other people. So we flew into motion and used that energy and that knowledge in the room to craft what became quite early on in the pandemic, a resource guide for people with disability about COVID-19 and managing it.
So now you've gone into like fight mode, of fight and flight mode. It's COVID now. We're in the middle of Delta. Everything's shut down. And now you have a situation where there are people who are immunocompromised who can't leave their house. There are people who are immunocompromised who then need to have carers come in and do personal care type stuff, food preparation, that sort of thing. It's risky. It's very risky. Are there any other things that you observed in that time? Because I could go on and on and on about like the things that happened that we probably didn't prepare for and we didn't really take notice of. I mean, it was great that at some point Woolworths was like, yes, we're going to be delivering to people with disabilities, food related stuff, but then we're not addressing certain things like what about carers? If you are somebody with a disability who relies a lot on carers and your carer who you have trust in now has COVID, do you then go, let's risk it because we don't have any other options and training for this sort of thing is difficult, or what would you do?
And doesn't the pandemic really bring to the surface the very fact of the disadvantage for people with disability when it comes to disasters? Fewer choices, fewer opportunities to access and use risk information to make those choices and to put things under their control. and to take those actions. And so that's what our COVID-19 guide was actually all about getting the facts in your own hands, being able to make those choices and decisions, knowing what we know at the time, what as best evidence as we had at the time about how you could manage that. And one of the things that our colleagues with disability helped us to design was very simple, a stop sign that they could put on their door that was for anyone coming into the home, their support provider, someone dropping off groceries, any kind of home care provider, that just said stop. And there was an opportunity for them to write in their specific instructions at the door about their expectations for anyone coming to the door. So for some people, that was, I want you to fully PPE up before you come in the door. And then once you've come in, I want you to, wash your hands at the sink and glove up there and so on. For other people, there were instructions, and remember back in the day when we were still wiping down our groceries, others it was about wiping down the groceries before putting them away, and anything kind of in between. And that was a way to have some control before people even knocked on the door over what was going to happen once they came inside. I imagine for people that's really hard, because when you're in a trusting relationship with someone, but you're dealing with a pandemic that really could be life-threatening for you, it's a fuzzy place to say, I have firm values about what I want here, but I also have these needs, and I also have a relationship with you. That's a very complex space for people to be in.
You're putting together this emergency plan for COVID, and again, it comes back to the capability wheel of you yourself giving your own instruction first, but now you're up against politicians and legislators trying to roll out these emergency things now. And coming back to the thing you were mentioning about domestic violence and people with disabilities, there was some talk and then some action for evacuation for people who were victims of domestic violence, because they saw an uprise in the number of people who were being injured or hospitalized or otherwise. What, if anything, did you do at that point to try and connect with politicians and, aside from just emergency services, about what needs to be prioritized?
Well, actually, at this time, this was all about the time when that kind of disability advocacy response was happening, and Australia was standing up their national committee of people with disability to advise and provide that nationwide advice and support to and for and on behalf of people with disability. It was right about that time. So one thing that I think was really great was we started making this guide because the Queensland government said, yes, let's make that happen. So funded the Queenslanders with Disability Network and ourselves to get this guide up and running. The second it was up and running, the ACT said, can we put that out through the ACT? Let's make a few adjustments of the contact numbers and details. We'll put it out there. ACT, to their credit, and I found this out after the fact by one of my government colleagues, they printed and delivered a COVID-19 guide to every household in the ACT at the time. I thought that was pretty amazing. And then very shortly after that, the Australian Government Department of Health said, we want to make this a nationwide resource. So it was from that moment. And I think we got this out for June 1st. I think it was out publicly by June 1st of 2020, after it had been reviewed by everyone and that national committee that I mentioned. And we've actually since updated it as well. So the Department of Health has updated it, and we made sure that this was available also in an easy read version. So the New South Wales Council for Intellectual Disability did the translation and the testing of the easy read version of the guide. So last March 2022, we did an update to the guide based on newer information, vaccinations, and other things to the guide too.
I'm so glad you mentioned easy reading literature. And so when you're talking about things like PSEP, when you're talking about things like the capability wheel, when you're talking about a literal emergency in front of you, you need to have the opportunity to have people access easy to read literature.
And you need them to have been included on a journey long before a disaster happens, so that all the other stress that we all experience when there's a disaster and pressures to make decisions that mess with our cognition on the best of times, in these stressful times, we need to have really pre-thought what's going to happen. So one of the exciting things, we can talk about the capability wheel maybe now.
Yeah, totally. Go for it.
Yeah, uncover its mystery. The capability wheel came about, and we call it the capability wheel because it's all of the things you can do for yourself, all the ways you get support from other people. And everything in between. And I love how the language of the capability wheel has just taken off, because it really has that feeling and that vibe of, it's about strengths, not what we can't do, but it's actually what we can do and how we manage. But it came about because we were looking at the literature worldwide about what does everyone need to do to prepare for a disaster. And so what are those things? They really culminate in 3, you can maybe say 4 things. We need to think about our living situation. And we need to think about that in a number of ways, right? So if we live in an apartment that has a lift, we need to think about power and what level we live on. For example, being able to evacuate and get out. We need to be maybe thinking about whether we're in a bush-prone area and whether we need to be removing and clearing brush from our properties and removing leaves from our eaves and things that can be a risk for an ember attack when there's bushfires. But we also need to be thinking of our living situation in terms of our general geography and proximity to risk and our proximity to other people and resources and amenities and things around us. So living situation is important for everyone. And then it has additional things for people with disability that are going to be unique to them. Social connectedness. We all have to worry about that because the person standing next to you when a disaster strikes is your first responder. So we really need to think about who we're connected to, comfortable with, not connected to, or separated from. And then transportation, especially if we need to evacuate, but also if we need to access materials and supplies if we're sheltered for a long period of time. So the COVID was a good example of that.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking about people who live in rural communities where it's surrounded by grass and then you have a grass fire and it could be a matter of minutes.
And where if you don't have transportation, good luck finding a taxi when that town has 4 and you've got to travel. Yeah.
And the city is like an hour away, or any shop is like 2 hours away, or in some cases for people 6 hours away.
So those are really big issues around transportation. So you just compound that with the extra support. So someone might have a vehicle, but they need someone to drive it, or they don't have a vehicle and they don't have access to a vehicle, or they're far away from anyone else with access to a vehicle. All of that needs to be negotiated in a disaster. And if you're in an urban setting, similarly, it may be that it's the metro lines that are actually going to be shut down for power reasons and so on. So those are the things we all need to think about, but there's other things we all need to think about too. So communication is something we need to think about, because what happens when the power goes out? Now that we don't have landlines anymore and we're all on mobiles, what happens when we don't have access to power, those mobile towers and so on? But communication has more specific things for people who get, give, receive, and understand information differently than other people. So it has other layers and other pieces to it. And then communication also has those elements of who do we trust to get information from and to communicate that information to us, and who do we feel confident, like in my example of my colleague, who does he feel most comfortable and relaxed to communicate more fluidly with? And then I suppose the other thing that we all need to think about is whether we take medications or wear our glasses. There's sort of routine medical and health things we would want to be thinking about in a disaster. But for people with disability, probably a lot more things. So we're talking about things like medical supplies. I love one of our early co-designs, and she appears in our videos, Marge. I love her reflections on what she needs. So she has a spinal injury, and we're going through the capability wheel with her, and she's going around each of these elements and sort of reflecting on every day. And then the second time we go around the capability wheel again, and now we're actually thinking about, well, what would you need to think about for planning for a disaster? And she gets to the management of health again the second time around. She goes, I guess I should pack some catheters.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And some bags. I don't think this appears on any of our videos, but it's a wonderful moment where she, with a bit of humor, goes, you can't borrow that from your best friend.
It's very true, and it's so specific. that person-centered emergency preparedness is easily translatable if, and I'm taking it entirely from my own experience, you come home and your lift is broken and you can't get in and it's 6 hours. Have you got enough catheters to be able to go somewhere to use the bathroom if you need it? What are you going to do for 6 hours? Because that happened to me 3 occasions in a row.
Wow. Thank you for that example, because it is so poignant. And I think it gets to the heart of the capability wheel and why we think about the everyday and why we think about how have you managed this in unusual circumstances that you've had more than once in this case on 3 occasions in just 1 year. Oh.
Well, everything you were saying about, who did you contact first? Who was then your second point of contact? Then where did you have to go from there? It was literally yes, I am going to person A. Person A is working. I have to go to person B. Person B is available. They live on a floor above. They're willing to, they need to come down, get my key, go back up, get some stuff. And because that situation was unexpected, it was pretty, I was pretty affected by it because I'm I don't know what I'm going to do, but I have all my medical equipment with me. I just need to have some extra stuff, which is in the apartment. Who do I contact? But that all comes back down to, what are your needs? Who are you going to contact? Transportation, because that was involved in some way. It was translatable.
Yeah. And I imagine also that the stress, the pinch points that would make it harder to feel calm, cool, and collected as you're communicating what your needs are and where to find that in my apartment and sort of visually locate everything when you're not physically able to get into.
Oh, yeah. And I basically just said to him, turn on your video and then take a video if you need to, because I might not be able to direct you.
Brilliant. That's a good idea. But you know what? Maybe we should just turn back to the rest of the elements of the capability wheel just while we're on this this thought, because the management of health is a good one because it helps people to think beyond medications. And I think the generic emergency preparedness kits, remember your medications or remember your contact lenses, it might go just that far. This goes deeper. So people with disability are telling other people with disability, don't forget about this. I have this packed in my kit. And that's the kind of stuff it can be very personal. And so it's best to come from people with disability who share these experiences and can give you ideas about, oh yeah, that is something I would not want to be without, from Marge, her catheters and her bags ready to go. And management of health can also be, just our routine things we might not even think about. How do we manage our food and our food intake, whether there's additional supplies related to food? For parents of children with disabilities, a lot of sterilization of supplies, whether it's PEG or G-tube feeding and things like this. So it really helps to cue people about the details. Once you have been living with a disability for a while, these are just part of your routine, right? So when you think about planning for an emergency, you can forget that, oh, these are details I actually need to put into my plan and take account of. So we have those things that everybody needs to do: living situation, social connectedness, transportation. We all need to be thinking about communication on some level and our medications at a minimum and other health-related needs. But for people with disability, the communication and the medication goes much deeper. And we added a couple of other elements. And one is assistive technology. So all the support that you get from equipment, but not people. And then we added personal support. So all of the support you get from people, not equipment. And of course, those things often go together. But it's nice to be able to have these things broken down on the capability wheel so you can think your way through and also think about how they relate. The other piece that we put into here was assistance animals. And over the last 18 months or more, as we keep taking this for a field test with more and more people, we've come to see how much people value not just an official assistance animal, but a companion, a pet, their livestock. And so we've really encouraged people to think about assistance animals, other companion support, or other animals, and making sure that that's embedded in the capability wheel. So there's basically these 8 elements and it's in a circle. I had, for some reason, just put these words in a circle. We didn't even have any images at the time for them. We just had the findings from the research and a name for each of these circles. And we put it in front of Marge on that day and it just worked so beautifully. She just naturally started where she wanted, worked around the circle, skipped the ones that didn't apply to her, and started unpacking how she gives, receives support, what her social networks look like, how she manages, what are the pinch points on a routine basis. And you know what I loved about that conversation and that very early testing of this resource was the service providers who were experiencing these early testing and debriefing with us. They said, oh my God, I learned more about Marge in that 20-minute conversation going around the person-centered wheel than I have known about her in the last 5 years of providing support to her in her home. And, you know, that for us was like, that sealed the deal. It's a circle. People have control over this capability wheel. Now we have pictures for it, and people can really just work their way through it. And our colleagues with disability who've put the tips and tricks, you can go through the workbook. If you want more than just the circles, you can actually go look for probing questions and get some strategies from other people.
Back to the story about the man explaining what's going to happen when there's an emergency and just panicking and then not being able to communicate properly. It's not just him that doesn't know how to communicate properly. Like if you're in a flood situation and you can't communicate how you need to get out of here, and it's so many things. Like, I'm just thinking about it now. We've talked about fire a lot, but what about floods? Floods are a huge deal for people with disabilities. We have stories of clients clients in northern New South Wales. The Lismore floods happened like 2 years ago, and people are still unable to have the right accommodation for them. From what I have heard, flood is very, very different long term. So when you have a fire and it just takes out your house and then you rebuild that house, with a flood it's very different because you still have the house standing-ish, but everything inside is just a pile of garbage, and it just takes ages and ages, if at all, to rebuild.
And think about that, how we psychologically prepare for emergencies. I mean, you kind of think, how can anyone psychologically prepare for that kind of disaster? But the more prepared you are, and the more you've backed up things that have such meaning and value to you, the better you can recover after the fact. So, imagine a situation where people might have lost really cherished framed photographs that they might never have digitized, but that were lost in the flood. Some of those things that have such significant meaning for people, things that were connected to loved ones who've passed, that were in that home, that created a sort of a cherished memory. Those are the kinds of things that come up in planning conversations especially when you can have this, just having the conversation, and really dialoguing together about what works and what you're worried about and what brings meaning. Those can be the starting points that help people to prepare too. We often talk about, why aren't people prepared? Why aren't people more prepared? It's even in our research, only about 30% of people will say, yeah, I actually have a preparedness plan. That's a lot of people without preparedness plans. And even those people who are prepared, the details are typically sorely lacking. But if you can come in to speak in a genuine way about what would you miss most, and what are the things that you could back up, or what could you take care of now, that could be a really meaningful starting point. And pets are a great way to do that. A lot of people will plan for their pets before they will plan for themselves. So that can really start a preparedness journey. The other thing you talked about, though, before was also that link to this has application everywhere. And you gave your own example of being locked out of your apartment or because the lift was not working, so you couldn't get to your apartment. But the same is true for people in all kinds of different circumstances. So we've been working with people who work in the field of mental health and healthcare, and they work with people who've experienced domestic violence, for example, or have other mental health conditions and so on. They are finding that going around the capability wheel is really quite supportive. So a plan to evacuate from a domestic violence situation is really applicable to going around the capability wheel and planning for how you will evacuate in an emergency situation. And so colleagues who are working in diverse areas, we're now working on a project in Queensland that's focused on the lived experience of homelessness. And how can we adapt this and think about material and physical preparedness for people where a disaster is a big deal for them because they might actually lose literally all of their belongings in an event that might not be a huge disaster for us, like a serious storm, for example. The relationship, in fact, high correlation between people who are homeless and who have disability is quite high. And so those are really important considerations to take into account. I'm thinking, just as you're talking about cold, I'm remembering back to 1998 in Canada when the ice storm hit our community. And that was over 10 days without power. And even beyond those 10 days, the streets were still pretty icy and the trees had fallen down and iced over, blocking most of the streets. So physical access for people, even people who were ambulatory, physical access was nearly impossible. So imagining people relying on wheelchairs or walkers or other mobility devices to get around, it was just an impossible situation. And for people who are dependent on power and being without power. So these are the kinds of considerations that we want people to be pre-planning for, over-preparing for. Better to be over-prepared for these events and know what you're going to do and how you're going to manage them.
So what is the biggest takeaway you want people to take away from person-centered emergency preparedness?
I think there's two things I would really like people to understand about the PSEP. The first thing is it's about enabling preparedness support starting from wherever you're at. So whether you're using it yourself to, gently move yourself along to a more prepared level, or whether you're facilitating a conversation to support and enable someone else to make a plan. It's really about a process of putting the person in the driver's seat so that they have choice, agency, control. Their world is about them and they know most about themselves, so they know most about how the preparedness planning process should go. And that preparedness support should come alongside connecting people in to the more knowledgeable others who have the right information at the right time when we need it. And so step 2 of PSEP is actually all about connecting people in with emergency risk information, making sure we're helping people to make that information more accessible, translating that material if needed, whether it's by communicating with people that trust us about what those risks are and unpacking that a little bit, or whether it's working with our emergency services so they can make their resources more accessible. So it's about preparedness support. It's about starting where people are at and moving them along a continuum, as preparedness is a process, not a one-time event. And the second thing is it's about connecting people to trusted information, people, supports, and resources, because none of us are going to solve the challenges of disaster alone. And for people who have complex needs and disabilities and supports on top of that, we're all going to actually need to come together before, during, and after a disaster to make sure people have the supports that they need. And we can learn much more about what those supports are and how to put them in place and how to respond more effectively if we're actually all in the know. So the thing about PSEP is it quite naturally brings those stakeholders to collaborate better together.
I'm just thinking if no one is telling emergency services that they exist, then they don't know you exist. So then it means that it's not getting to the legislators and the politicians.
That's such an important point. We always say that step 1 is the new thing in PSEP about emergency preparedness, starting with myself and the capability wheel and working my way through what are my strengths and support needs on an everyday basis. Step 2 is business as usual. Know your risk, know your level of preparedness, and learn about your risks, and start to understand how to begin matching your support needs with your risk situation. Step 3 also isn't that new because it's about making the plan. In this case, though, it's about tailoring that plan and making sure it's tailored specifically to your support needs and situation. The second part that's new, though, is our step 4. Step 4 is about communicating the plan with people who need to know. And I think we could take a conversation like this. I tend to be passionate and enthusiastic and maybe rosy about all of this stuff in terms of what people are able to do. But I think it's really important to recognize that even going through the PSEP, some people will still have gaps in their plans that will put them at disproportionate risk, that may risk their lives, their safety, and their well-being in a disaster. And we cannot forget that fact. And so step 4 is all about connecting that information back in to our community level plans. So our local governments, supported by their state governments and their emergency management arrangements, are required to make plans that keep all of community safe. So if we can collect this information one individual at a time, and then as a population or as a community of people, and we can start to think about what are the common risks that a lot of us face that need to be put into our community level plans with council. And the PSEP is really helping us to grow that and grow those partnerships with councils and grow an understanding about what needs to be in their emergency management plans. So we're talking about things like communication and transportation and evacuation centers and its accessibility with councils. And I'm really pleased to say, when we started this work in 2015, we had the idea, we had those 4 principles, and we had no tools. And now we have a plethora of tools, a wealth of advocates and people who are really on board with this. But we also have new rules. So Australia's disability strategy in 2021, the end of 2021, for the first time, included disability inclusive emergency planning and provisions for thinking about the individual and the community level needs that people will have. So that new strategy that's 2021 to 2031 is really exciting for Australia. And there's an outcomes framework and a targeted action plan on how this is going to happen. And I feel like that's our big job now as a research team, is to help develop the capacity to get people to those outcomes. But the other thing we have been able to do is influence legislative change. So we now have, under the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the Quality and Safeguarding Commission legislation amendment that requires people providing, all services providing services and supports to people under the NDIS to have emergency and disaster management plans in place, and that those intersect with the service continuity and planning for the people that they support. We have a person-centered emergency preparedness certificate course that's offered through the University of Sydney. If anyone's interested in taking that. What is so exciting is one of the learning activities we have people do at the end of step 1 is we have them go practice having a conversation using the capability wheel. And the stories we get back from all kinds of learners, because people with disability, services that support them, emergency services and government all take this course together. And they tell amazing stories of having conversations with their children, with their parents, with their family, with their friends, with their husbands or wives and neighbors, using the capability wheel. And I'm really pleased that they have resounding success rate and deep conversations and really creative ways of using just the capability wheel to start that conversation and empower people. So it's really exciting. But that's not without challenges. There are often some, people who are quite stoic and I'll be all right and, worry about someone else. And so those conversations really help to break down some of those barriers and help people open up in a way that's right for them, starting with the element of the capability wheel that is, the right place for them to start the conversation. I suppose if I were to give anyone a final message on your podcast, Susan, I would say put your oxygen mask on first, pick up a PSEP, whether you have a disability or not, and start working through your plan, because the more prepared we are as individuals, the more we can support and prepare other people as a community, and the safer we'll all be when disasters inevitably strike.
If you want to know more about the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness Toolkit, you can find a link to this and more in the show notes in the episode. This episode of Have the Nerve is written, produced and edited by me, Susan Wood, and logo art by Cobie Ann Moore. If you would like to read more about emergency preparedness and articles talking about the lessons from the lack of inclusion of people with disabilities, head to our resource hub at scia.org.au. Thank you for listening.